This lecture is on cosmology, the study of everything that exists. What I will do today is go over the single Big Bang model, which is the current model of cosmology, and explain why it cannot be true. And then I will go over the infinite cosmos model that I proposed and explain why it resolves all the conflicts. The single Big Bang model has been proposed for a long time. It originally occurred because Hubble noticed a redshift. When things were moving further away or were away from us, the further away they were, the larger the redshift was. And it's just a shift in the frequency of light towards the red, which happens. Everything that he said, I think, is true, except that the redshift doesn't really indicate that things are moving away. So what they propose now is that everything came from nothing 13.8 billion years ago, and that everything is expanded out from that initial point during that time. There's quite a number, though, of issues with that. One of them being that the edge of the cosmos is always 13.8 billion years, light years away, which in essence puts us at the center of the cosmos. And I would say in an infinite cosmos, there is no center, so that we cannot be there. So the model saying that everything came from nothing, to me, is very similar to the fundamental Christians, who also say that everything came from nothing 6,000 years ago. The fundamental Christians say that God did it, but the scientists say no, everything came from 13.8 billion, came from nothing 13.8 billion years ago, and God had nothing to do with it. So the age is definitely a problem in this model, because we have stars that have 100 billion year lifetime. And how can you have a 100 billion year old star in a universe that's only 13.8 billion years old? So that was a definite problem, and I saw that way back in the 80s when the first hint of this problem came out. There was a story in Discover magazine, and it was called Crisis in the Cosmos. And that's what it said, is we have stars that are older than the universe, so how can that be? It's a crisis. So that's not possible. Also atoms, even the atoms in your body, some of them like uranium, had to be made in a supernova, and this supernova occurred at some time very far away and very far in the past. So it would have taken untold years, probably more than 13 billion years, for those molecules even to get, and atoms to get into our neighborhood and be incorporated in the material that makes up our solar system. So atoms being older than the universe is also a problem. Because they have this imaginary expansion, they've had to invent several things that are imaginary. The first one is dark matter, and they don't feel like there's enough matter in the cosmos to account for the motions that we see. But in the second half, when I describe my model, I'll explain how I would solve that problem. So they have to create imaginary dark matter, they have to create imaginary dark energy, and then there's a Hubble constant, which is supposedly the rate that this is expanding outward. The latest evidence that they have for this being true is that like 1 nanosecond after the Big Bang, everything was where it is right now. To me, that's evidence that it was already there to start with. Having something that expands from nothing and it fills this whole area, everything that we can see in a matter of 13 billion years, is just impossible. So all three of these are incorrect and can't be true. Anytime you have a constant that you have to balance on the head of a pen to get the number, it's a pretty good indication that it's not mathematically significant. And that's the problem they had. So the redshift doesn't show the direction. I believe it does show that things are further away, but it doesn't show which direction they're traveling. So Hubble just assumed that since the redshift was happening, everything was expanding out from this single point. This whole expansion is imaginary. One of the main problems with this, too, is this is just not a scientific model. In science, we have the cause and effect. For everything that we ever see, there's a cause and effect. There's something before the reaction, there's something after the reaction. You cannot start from nothing and have everything just appear out of nothing. That is not a scientific model. The only places I know where that can happen is in religion or magic, and I don't think either one of those apply to the cosmos. So cause and effect is not even being considered in this whole model, and it's therefore not even a scientific model. Another thing that never happens is they measure this distance, 13.8 billion, to this imaginary edge, and they say, well, that's the edge of everything, and that's the age of everything. but they never count the age of these galaxies that they're looking at, which have to be trillions upon trillions of years old when the light left them. Sure, it took 13.8 billion years to get here. That's okay. But how old was that structure when it emitted that light? Much, much older. So already we have all these different things that make it impossible for this model to be true. Another problem they have is the clumpiness of the cosmos. Everywhere what we see is galaxy clusters and then strings of galaxies that go between galaxy clusters. Each one of these would be representing a galaxy cluster. And so all this clumpiness has had to have occurred in their 13.8 billion years, and there's just not enough time for that to happen. So they have all these imaginary things that they develop. If we just consider that everything in the cosmos is moving in every direction, and that all motions are the reactions of all the interactions they've had with other mass, then it makes sense that everything is moving in every direction, and things are not expanding out from a single direction. So they really have no way of explaining the clumpiness of the cosmos. And then probably the most important of all is what's called the cone of knowledge. And I guess it's not even taught anymore in school, although I learned it in philosophy and I learned it in physics both. The cone of knowledge concept states that any viewpoint represents a cone. And the only things that we can know about are the things that light has had time enough to get to us in our cone. If light has not had a chance to get to us from any other place, then it is ultimately unknowable to us, and it is, we cannot make any determinations of what's there. We can only measure the things that we can actually see. So effectively, what the scientists have done by their single Big Bang is make this the edge of our cone of knowledge. They have looked out as far as they can see, and they find galaxies. And so they say that's the edge of everything. But the problem is every time they get a bigger telescope and they look a little further, they see galaxies even further away and even more galaxies. And so our cone of knowledge will expand over time as our telescopes enlarge, but the concept always remains true that we'll never be able to know everything that exists. We can only know those things in which light has had time to get to us and inform us that it exists. So the cone of knowledge is tremendously violated by this concept. What I propose is what I call the infinite cosmos model. And what I say is that the cosmos is infinite. This is just the edge of what we can see. But if you were transported from here to here and you looked out further, what would you see? You would see more galaxies continuing on forever. And if you went to this next point and looked as far as you could see, more galaxies would be out there as far as you can see. In the infinite cosmos model, the cosmos is both infinite in space and time. It never has a beginning, it never has an end. But one of the things that we need, if it never has a beginning or end, is there has to be some cycles within it that allow it to continue forever. And so that's why I proposed the single Big Bang, the Big Bang model, where there are multiple Big Bangs that occur, not just a single Big Bang. So let's go over each one of these and examine it under the infinite cosmos model. Stars older than the universe is no problem because they could have been invented or created in another Big Bang at some other point in space and time. And so that was what originally led me to work on this model, was realizing that these stars could have been created somewhere else. They didn't have to be involved in any one Big Bang that we might know about. Also, my model allows all the time for these atoms to accumulate and come to Earth. It doesn't require any of these things. The dark matter and expansion is only because we believe there's an imaginary expansion. And so we have to have the dark matter and the dark energy to balance everything out. But if there's no expansion from nothing, then those values are totally meaningless and they have no purpose in science. Cause and effect have to be in operation. So what I proposed is that when mass gets too high, and what this is black holes of a galaxy cluster. And when mass gets too intense, represented by these peaks, these systems come apart and they redistribute the energy. Now this, to help you better understand this is a galaxy supercluster. And it was taken by the Hubble telescope, and let's say this was the supercluster here. What they did was they used the Hubble as an eyepiece in a gigantic telescope, and they focus it on this galaxy here. But because of gravitational lensing, there was multiple images came back to this eyepiece because of the gravitational effect. What the scientists did then was have the computer calculate what the gravity would be in here, and that's what this picture is. So it tells us a whole bunch of things. It tells us that this is a gigantic number of galaxies. I suspect that these two galaxies here and this would represent more or less the size of our Milky Way galaxy and its associated galaxies. But look at all the galaxies that have accumulated in here. For years and years, I couldn't understand how these structures would get old because I thought they would keep accumulating mass to the point that it would reach too high a point and it would come apart. But I realized from this drawing what happens is that mass gets accumulated on these outside things, and these can remain relatively stable in here without accumulating new mass. So this is an example of what the gravity looks like in a galaxy cluster, and we see that it's centered in each of the galaxies. And so this solves the problem of dark matter, I believe, because all of the energy is shown to be here. And for things to orbit this, it must be connected to the center of these black holes to orbit. So that's one difference that I in my model over the single Big Bang model. The age of the galaxies is not a problem. Clumpies is not a problem. All these galaxies are formed because they've moved through space over time and picked up new material. And as they've done that, they've naturally collected into these different shapes. They naturally, gravity pulls them together into clusters, which, and also I believe forms these strings. But when a Big Bang happens, there's no such thing as an explosion, and things don't just move outward. What happens is the energy is just changed from organized gravitational and mass energy to just pure space energy. And my original model of this said that under equals GMC cubed, that basically what's happening is the material goes into a black hole, that energy is slowly being pulled out of the mass to add to the gravitational space. And that at some point, enough energy is pulled out that M goes to zero, the equation collapses, and that's when you have a Big Bang. So this is what I believe is happening here, is that these energies are being stored and they cannot reach the critical value because they're being protected from energy coming in from the outside. I originally thought that when this comes apart, though, all this gravitational energy just goes back to mass. But a friend of mine, Eugene Kovalinsko, told me that he believes it goes back to energy, and I would like to give him credit for that. I think that's what I believe now. Instead of this mass totally going into gravity, it goes into space energy. In these places between the galaxy clusters, there's immense energy, but we just can't see it or know about it because it's not gravitationally connected with us. And I believe that what happens is that space energy over time slows down, and when it gets the proper motions and stuff, it becomes a precursors to mass, and then those form together to make the first mass, which is an electron, the electron being the first particle that has gravity. From then on up, all the atoms, molecules, planets, all the larger structures all have gravity from the electron on up. So I believe there's a cycle that goes through. When this comes apart, all these components vanish, you just have E. Over time, they begin collecting into M, and over time, that begins obtaining gravity. And so it's an endless cycle that never stops. You can have universes that come and go, but the cosmos itself is staying permanent. So I've defined a universe as those things that revolve around a common center, making our Milky Way galaxy cluster our essential universe. And so one of the problems that I think that they have is with the redshift is that they don't understand that the redshift is not a sense of direction. If we was to look at our galaxy right here and say this is another galaxy here, it may be moving in this direction. And so when we attach gravitationally with it, we attach here. But as it moves this way, this graviton becomes bent and distorted. And so a scientist on Earth would think this was in this direction because that's where he's measuring the angle of the graviton. But in actuality, this particle may be way over here, this galaxy. The bending and the twisting of gravions distort space so that it makes it look like mankind is measuring that the whole thing is expanding away from us, but none of that is true. The distortions of gravity affect that. Also, I believe there's motions within our own galaxy that we are not aware of that are affecting the way that we view things outside our galaxy. And then the fact that these galaxies around ours are orbiting in a different direction than the galaxy is orbiting. Okay, so what I've told you is that the single Big Bang model cannot be true. It requires an age to everything, and we have things that are much older than that to start with. It requires all these imaginary functions. It misinterprets the redshift as an imaginary expansion. It ignores cause and effect. It ignores the ages of the galaxies that are out there that we see that are tremendously old. It has no real explanation for compass. And then one of the most primal things, the code of knowledge, is totally and absolutely ignored. Everything that's outside of this that we can't know about, we cannot speculate on. And to say that there's nothing there, I think, is a mistake. And so the gravionic model, part of it is the infinite cosmos model, and it corrects all these different problems, allowing an infinite cosmos, things moving in every direction. There is no beginning or end to it, and we're not at the center of it. And thank you so much.